Chapter 1. Natalie Castellano had spent the better portion of the last 5 years in the shadow of happily ever after. Usually it came from the family bridal boutique or the Knot Festival committee, sometimes from the 5-story wedding cake monument standing guard over downtown Bliss. But today it came from the man who had broken her fairy tale. He was back, and if the Queen General got her way, which she always did, he was back to stay. Bliss was giving Natalie the blues, in more ways than one. She wove through the crowded foyer of St. Valentine's Catholic Church, focused on 2 goals: be invisible and avoid C.J. Blue. All 200 million of his relatives, or possibly only 50 or 60 of them, filled the foyer and blocked her path to a stained glass door leading outside. It wasn't just a door, it was escape. Escape from the well-dressed crowd, escape from the overpowering perfume of wedding flowers, escape from her own memories and regrets and guilt. She clutched her sewing kit in her slick hand and stopped when yet another pastel-clad woman sporting a corsage stepped into her path. Natalie ducked her head and dodged right. "Excuse me," she murmured. The last few years she'd gotten good at being invisible at weddings. More like she'd gotten good at not making appearances at weddings at all. Were it not for today's high-profile guest list, both the bride and groom had spent the last several years touring with the bands of some mega country music stars. Natalie wouldn't have left the bridal boutique to do an emergency fix on a veil she hadn't sold for C.J. Blue's sister. Nevertheless, Nat couldn't pass up the chance to represent Bliss Bridal among a crowd like this. The boutique couldn't buy this kind of publicity. The boutique couldn't buy any publicity lately. Not in Bliss. If the Queen General caught Natalie here, though, publicity would be the least of Bliss Bridal's problems. So Nat had kept her name to herself in the bride's quarters and dropped a few generic Bliss Bridal business cards in the room. And now she was alternately keeping her head down and scanning the crowd while she zigzagged for the door. Dress, 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 tuxedo, check the hair, no red, keep going. Dress, 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 tuxedo. 15 more feet and she'd be outside, then a dash across the parking lot, and with any luck, the Queen General would never know Natalie had been here. 4 chattering women stepped into Nat's path. She dodged left and bumped into the chalky ivory wall. Another 2 women approached from her side. She slid along the wall until she was boxed in by a closed wooden door, a table holding church bulletins, and a group of women more fragrant than a bride's bouquet. 14 more feet, and the crowd was swelling around her like jellyfish. "Excuse me," she murmured again. The back of her neck prickled, then the backs of her knees. A tinny taste tickled the back of her tongue. Oh, shit. What was she doing here? She should have been setting up a wedding cake somewhere. But there she was, the Queen General herself, marching through a crowd that parted for her like trees splitting in a tornado. A tornado headed away from Natalie, for the moment. Marilyn Elias, Queen General of Bliss, had more power than the mayor, probably more power than the governor of Illinois. As chairperson of the entire Knot Festival, she oversaw the annual week devoted to Bliss's celebration of its very purpose: weddings and marriage and bliss. She managed the subcommittees responsible for every Knot Fest event, from the parade to the bridal expo to the husband games, Bliss's final festival event, where men competed in a series of challenges, like lawn mowing, dishwashing, and wife kissing, to be named Husband of the Year. And she did it all with the single-minded, take-no-prisoners drive usually reserved for dictators, bridezillas, and cartoon villains. Natalie hugged the wall, one eye straining to follow the QG, the other on the outer door she could barely glimpse now. She had to escape. Now or never. "Excuse me," she said. Her voice drowned in the normal pre-wedding chatter. She tried to shift around the table, but the crowd pushed her back against the door. The QG stopped near the chapel entrance. Natalie could tell because the shuffle of bodies stopped. But she had another clue, too. A big one, towering over the female-dominated crowd, his back to her. A man, in black, with red hair. A word entirely inappropriate for a church squeaked through her lips. Forget escape. Nat had to hide. A man didn't grow up with 11 sisters without learning how to effectively duck the squawking, and CJ Blue thought he had outdone himself today. He was equal parts impressed and horrified at the depths to which he'd sunk in his quest for an estrogen-free zone. But between his sisters and Mom in one room screeching about a ripped veil, and the multitudes of aunts and girl cousins lurking around every pew, all giving him the "how you doing, you poor thing" look, a guy had to take what he could get. What he got was a gift from God himself, an empty confessional. His brother Basil, Father Basil to the members of his newly assigned parish of St. Valentine's here in Bliss, said confessions were mostly done face-to-face now, so the room was never used. Bonus, Basil was tied up preparing for the wedding mass. No one would look for CJ here. But just in case, he made himself at home behind the screen in the red vinyl lounge chair on the priest's side of the dimly lit room. Everything smelled vaguely of christening oil. The muffled murmur of a crowd told him the rest of his relatives were arriving. He'd escaped just in time, so now he could pop back out at the opportune moment to witness Saffron's nuptials, while avoiding the relatives asking his feelings on his sister's decision to have a destination wedding here, of all places. They always added, of all places. But until the ceremony, he had a comfy chair, blessed semi-quiet, and a God-given reprieve from guilt and condolences and memories. After the ceremony, he had about 24 more hours of family obligations, and then he could hit the road and leave this all behind. Again. He set his watch alarm, closed his eyes, and pictured the sunrise he'd experienced at the summit of Mount Kilimanjaro a week ago. As he was about to doze off, the door on the other side of the screen wrenched open. A louder hum of female voices wafted in on the draft. Just as quickly, the door clicked shut, and CJ's peace was restored. Momentarily. "Oh, shit," a woman said. Her voice rippled with the kind of panic CJ expected from the bride today, but her husky undertones were too low for her to be any of his female relatives. Perhaps the confessional hadn't been a gift from God after all. If that's what you need to do. But not right now, please, CJ said. Her shriek splintered his last hopes for peace. "Oh my God!" his intruder gasped. "Not generally, but hey, if that's what you want to call me, I'm game." You... what?" He'd learned his lesson about that tone when his sister Pepper got him with the tailpipe off Basil's first heap of junk, which meant goading his unexpected visitor was a bad idea. He covered the family jewels and settled deeper into the chair. Never mind. Like I said, wrong guy. She inhaled a ragged breath. Sorry. I thought this was an office." A shadow moved behind the screen, as if she were heading out. Guilt nipped at his chest. Probably a good thing she was leaving, whoever she was. But the shadow stopped. If he were looking close, which curiosity might have encouraged him to do, but through only one eye, because he still wouldn't have minded that nap, he might have seen the shadow's head drop, heard a wobbly breath. For courage? Sympathy added a few prickles to the guilt. Nah, not an office. It's more personal than that, he said. More personal? As personal as it gets. She started muttering then, Words he wouldn't have been able to understand even if he had been able to see her face. But the acoustics in this room were impressive, and he did have a lifetime of experience with translating irritated female. Not that he cared to translate. He'd let her mumble herself out, she'd leave, and he'd get back to dreaming about where he'd been and where he was headed next. "I'm sorry," he said, because he was an idiot. Right. Get out so you can do your business." Her shadow hovered at the doorway. His business. Sleeping, avoiding relatives, not asking her questions, not thinking about Serena and weddings and how the confessional suddenly smelled like oranges, just like Serena had. His other eye slid open, along with one of those psychological wounds his sisters had spent the last 58 hours talking at him about. "My business?" he prompted the woman, because it was better than thinking about oranges. "You know what?" she said. "What if I just cover my ears? I can't see anything, and everybody does it, so what's the big deal?" Whatever the lady thought everybody did in here, CJ was fairly certain this wasn't it. Besides, he knew for a fact he never did what the room was designed for, and he suspected most of his sisters avoided it whenever possible, too, plus that whole majority of the world that wasn't Catholic. "No need to cover your ears," CJ said. I do it quietly." "You know what else?" she said. "Most buildings would at least have the courtesy to put a big sign on the door so you can't miss it." "A sign for what?" CJ straightened. The orange scent was fading, and his mind was engaging in a puzzle. This was good. Better than where his mind had been headed. In my experience, the people who want to use a confessional don't need the sign. Oh, God. A hollow knock sounded, like a head hitting a door. Shit. I'm sorry. Didn't mean to say God. Really. His chuckle caught him off guard. Of all the things he thought he'd be doing today, laughing inside a confessional wasn't one of them. You're forgiven?" He didn't so much hear her suspicion dawning. He smelled it. Familiar odor, that. Sort of like a bad pork chop on top of department store perfume, set off by female intuition, and probably hormones, too. So much for funny. Still better than oranges. "Are you the new priest?" she said. "No, ma'am. Just a single guy too early for a wedding." More voices echoed on the other side of the wall, louder and closer. He couldn't make out the exact words of the conversations outside, which gave him hope the confessional was as private as it was supposed to be, but he should have been whispering. Basil would be pissed if he found CJ in here like this, and CJ still had enough respect for the collar that he wouldn't suggest they take it out back to settle the grievance. "You're hiding, too," the woman said, the husky back in her voice. Distrust? Or was she intrigued? "So few places to do it effectively," he said. If she got the hint, she ignored it. "Are you in the wedding?" "Nope." Dylan, the groom, had more best friends than CJ had sisters. Cleared him of all responsibility. Didn't even get asked to be an usher. Or maybe Saffron didn't want to pick any more of his scabs. "Why so early?" his intruder asked. "I was in housekeeping's way." He could have stayed at the rectory, but Basil's housekeeper was stopping by with her very single daughter. "You?" "Oh, I'm not here for the wedding. Not to attend the wedding. The bride had a problem with her veil. All fixed now, so I should get going." She didn't move. Not her shadow, not her scent, which was getting more orangey again since the suspicion had left her voice. Not even her breath seemed to move. CJ waited, held his own breath. "You having some trouble with somebody out there?" he asked. He didn't know jack about any of these musician types Saffron and Dylan had invited today, and he wouldn't tolerate it if a single one of them made any of his sisters or cousins or nieces uncomfortable. "Oh, no, not today, exactly. It's just..." She blew out a shaky laugh. Hey, this is a confessional, right? Basil would have his head if he didn't cut this off right now. Technically, there has to be a licensed operator for it to actually be a confessional. Licensed operator? Licensed from God. I'm not. Just a normal guy here. You sure nobody's giving you grief? I'm fine, she said. I'm just hiding from the Queen General and her latest poster boy. The Queen General? Which one of his sisters fit that description? More like which one didn't. Queen General Marilyn, his visitor said, supreme ruler of Bliss and chairperson of Knot Festival. The words, Knot Festival, twisted CJ's stomach, and the room seemed to climb 10 degrees hotter. He tugged at his bow tie. The woman kept talking. According to the Queen General, divorced women don't belong in Bliss's bridal business, and divorced women don't belong at Knotfest, and divorced women especially don't belong at high-profile Bliss weddings. He couldn't tell if it was bitterness or regret coloring her words, but he would happily worry about someone else's problems if it helped him ignore the itching beneath his undershirt. You live your life according to your rules or hers, he said. The last time a divorced person tried to buy a shop on the Isle, the Queen General was so displeased she made the town flood. He stared at her shadow. Her words were English, but when she put them together like that, she might as well have been speaking alien. Normal for a woman, but he'd take crazy woman talk over Knotfest talk and memories. He stretched out again. He could get her started, then doze off while she rambled. He was good at grunting go-on noises in his sleep. God bless his sisters. Do tell, he said. She probably didn't actually cause the flood, the woman said, but she did keep the divorced guy from buying the shop. She jacked up the price of joining the bra. CJ coughed. The what? The Bridal Retailers Association. All the businesses on the Isle belong. The Isle, right. This crazy town called their main street the Isle. The QG runs the Isle, the woman said. So when this divorced guy tried to buy the party supply store, she went apeshit. She ordered the mayor to host a special wedded Bliss celebration that spring, married people only. So not you, he said, because he was oddly fascinated that Bliss wasn't perfect. His new whatever she was did that delicate snorting thing again. She had the governor sign a proclamation naming Bliss the most family-friendly city in Illinois because of the wedded Bliss thing. Most marriedest town on earth, and she won't let anyone forget it. You don't want to know what she did to discourage people from getting within 4 shops of the place this guy wanted to buy. And when he didn't leave fast enough for the QG, the town flooded. He opened a shop somewhere north of Chicago instead. And you want to live here? Why? He knew better than to question a woman about her logic. But since this woman had invaded his confessional, he kept making rookie mistakes. He braced himself, waiting for the inevitable, you couldn't possibly understand. That one drove him nuts. Instead, she dove right into the last psychological wound his sisters hadn't hit yet. First, there was the soft sigh. Then her shadow drooped, and her voice did too. It's home. The sentiment echoed in the small room, her longing overshadowing any of her frustrations or regrets. Home. A hot shiver prickled the back of his neck. His parents' farm down near Peoria would always be home, but not like the home the yearning in her voice spoke of. Her home sounded like family and kids and happiness, like meatloaf and mashed potatoes, birthday parties with kazoos and paper hats, pets and chaos and laughter. Or maybe he was imagining what he'd always wanted. The confessional was hot as hell. Even his balls were sweating. I've only lasted this long because my parents have done so much good for the community, she said. They've buffered me. Self-loathing. Now that was a feeling he could relate to. He felt her shuddery breath rattle his own ribcage. He needed to stop her. Maybe crash through the screen and dive out of the room into safer territory. But he'd seen his sisters in action enough to know her ears were becoming intake valves to keep her mouth running, and her brain had already launched into dump all my problems on the innocent bystander mode. She'd follow him until she said her piece, or until she sucked every last molecule of oxygen from the entire church. And he still had a few dozen female relatives waiting to wallop him with pity outside that door. But my mom's gone now, and I know I can't live here forever. I've made some mistakes, but I'd like to do a few more things my parents would be proud of before the Queen General destroys me. The yearning was back in her voice, and it did more to scrape CJ's wounds raw than his sisters had managed in all of the last 4 years. So if you don't mind, the woman continued, I'll just hang out here a few more minutes, and then she and her new Knotfest poster boy can go right off on their righteousness while I keep my mom's shop going. The defeat and anxiety and sadness in the confessional were making it hard to breathe. He had an overwhelming desire to offer her a hug, and an equally strong desire to hasten her departure from what was supposed to be his haven. He gripped the armrests on the chair, his palms sticking to the wood. Takes a hell of a lot of balls to live like that. You mean a hell of a lot of idiocy? I should have left months ago. Those games she played with the divorced guy? It's my turn. She rewrote the Golden Husband Games rules so her exalted widower is eligible to be named husband of the half-century. And you know what? He's the reason my husband left me. CJ squeezed his eyes shut. He hated the word widower almost as much as he hated mention of the husband games. 5 years ago, after eloping here, he had played, and despite not knowing much about being a good husband himself, he'd won. He shoved the memory away and latched on to the injustice done to his partner in hiding. Some guy destroyed her marriage, and now would get honored for it? What kind of place was this? Want me to kick his ass? No! Her shadow swayed. Please, I wasn't here. You didn't see me. We didn't talk. I don't exist. She chuckled, but there was nothing funny about it. And to think, most of my life I wanted to be her. A shaft of light broke through the room, and a cool draft whooshed a swell of conversation over the screen. Ma'am? Basil intoned in his holier-than-thou, constipated way. Can I help you? Are you lost? No, she said quickly. Yes, yes, actually. Yes, I'm lost. There was silence. Then, we, Basil said. Hell. CJ squinted at her shadow. Don't look this way. Don't look this way. Don't. Too late. CJ, Basil said. If you're in there. Yeah, CJ grumbled. CJ, the woman said, and if he wasn't mistaken, there was some horror lingering beneath her words. CJ Blue? Odd, both being recognized in a Bliss confessional, and that it would be horrifying. At your service, he said. Basil's long-suffering sigh made an unfortunately familiar appearance. Marring the sanctity of the confessional, CJ? Low, even for you. This, at least, was normal. If God's everywhere, how can one room be more sacred than anywhere else? He liked yanking Basil's chain. And besides, Basil's predictable, very disappointed in you theological lecture would be a welcome reprieve. Instead, another female voice broke in. Natalie, I wasn't aware you were Catholic. Or invited. Veil emergency! CJ's confessional intruder, Natalie, apparently, mustered more cheer than a horde of drunken elves, making CJ think he'd imagined the horror. Can't have a disappointed bride in bliss, can we? Natalie said. Guess I found the wrong room. Yes, yes, she had. "They're in the cry room," Basil said. "It's that way." "Thank you. Enjoy the wedding." A shuffling told CJ his hiding companion had just left him to the wolf in priest's clothing and whomever the new mystery woman was. Thank God. "We'll talk later," the woman said. Even though Natalie had hit all his sore spots, CJ felt a twinge of sympathy. Sounded like somebody was up for an ass chewing. "Something you'd like to confess, princess?" Basil said. "Jackass," CJ muttered. "Careful, little brother. You're still in God's house." True, but it was one more bit of normal he desperately needed. Besides, if he didn't react to the nickname, his siblings were more likely to call him by his real name. Their parents, free-spirited nature lovers that they were, had named all 13 of their children after spices. Basil had gotten the only decent male spice name. God bless Rosemary for insisting on calling CJ by his initials, and God bless, well, God for not gifting his parents with any more sons. CJ scooted around the screen and out of the confessional, ignoring the holy look of severe disappointment that generally kept people from mistaking CJ for his eldest sibling. The woman with Basil was somewhat familiar, and not just because she looked vaguely like Hillary Clinton. She was dressed in a white power suit and had neatly styled short hair with so many different shades of color in it, most occurring in nature, that he wasn't sure if she was blonde or brunette, though the sag beneath her chin suggested a natural gray. Given her erect posture and the silent demands for acquiescence to whatever she was obviously about to say, he was surprised any of her skin had the audacity to droop out of formation. A tingly sense of foreboding had more than just his balls sweating now. Basil clicked the confessional shut. "Mr. Blue," the woman said, "I have an exciting honor to discuss with you." CJ scrubbed a hand over his face. Honors in Bliss weren't his thing anymore. Whatever it was, he didn't want it. Wasn't so easy to say, though. Something about the woman made his tongue want to say yes, despite the fact that his brain, and one or two of his other favorite body parts, was screaming no. Took a swallow or two to find the appropriate deflection. "Appreciate the sentiment, ma'am, but I'm afraid I don't have the necessary respect for the collar." While the woman tittered, which was a demonic kind of sound, Basil's pious disapproval hit epic proportions. He puffed his chest, showing off his own collar. "Don't flatter yourself." "Mr. Blue." The woman offered CJ a hand so smooth it glowed, her pale blue eyes both inviting and scary as hell at the same time. "I'm Marilyn Elias. By the power vested in me as chairwoman of Bliss's Not Festival, I hereby invite you to participate in the Golden Husband Games." Marilyn Elias, chairwoman, not festival, queen general. No, no, not just no. Hell no. CJ opened his mouth. No, one word, 2 letters. He could say it. He had to say it. The Queen General blinked rapidly several times. Her eyes went unnaturally shiny. "The entire committee, of course, wishes your wife could be beside you. Such a tragedy." Suddenly she had a handkerchief in hand, dabbing at tears he suspected were made of cyanide. "But we believe you, a widower of a decorated military heroine and one of our most popular former husbands of the year, deserve the opportunity to compete to be crowned Bliss's husband of the half-century." Marilyn turned to a couple CJ hadn't noticed lurking behind her. "Surely you know what a wonderful husband this man was." CJ's world twisted another crank. They weren't random wedding guests. They were Serena's parents, Bob and Fiona, CJ's in-laws. He hadn't seen them since her funeral. He'd planned to stop by their place tomorrow, say hi, see how they were doing since the flood, since Bob's battle with cancer last year. But there they were, here, now, at his sister's wedding, with the Queen General of Bliss, waiting for him to accept or decline a reenactment of his wedding week. This time without his bride. Fiona smiled a watery, wobbly, this would mean the world to me kind of smile, her mouth wrinkling in the corners, the sag under her eyes suggesting she'd aged more than 4 years since the funeral. Bob watched him with hopeful expectation, and CJ saw Serena's ghost pleading with him through her father's tired eyes. You promised we'd come back here and have a big party with our families for our 5th anniversary. The Queen General, apt name that, turned back to CJ with a beseeching look that was ruined by the freaky don't fuck with me quality behind her tear shine. Please, Mr. Blue, please do us the honor of agreeing to participate in the Golden Husband Games in your wife's honor. The niggling thought he'd been suppressing burst forth. He cast a glance around the vestibule, but the suddenly nauseatingly irritating Natalie was nowhere to be seen. A sea of his sisters in their green bridesmaid dresses were, though, all his cousins, all his aunts, a handful of Dylan and Saffron's musician buddies, all watching him, waiting, judging him. He couldn't breathe. Let us help you honor Serena's memory, Marilyn Elias said. This woman could take all his sisters together in the contest for crazy scary. Hell, if he'd be anybody's poster boy. Poster boy. Natalie had been bitching about CJ. The exalted widower, the Queen General's poster boy. None of them had a clue what they were asking, who they were asking. I'm certain he'll be honored, Basil said. CJ stepped back, but the plaintive hope brightening Fiona's weathered face made him choke on his denial. But of course he'll have to give it due consideration and consult his calendar, Basil continued. The Queen General beamed. Of course, my dear CJ, of course. And the Knotfest Committee will be pleased to offer you any assistance necessary in making your decision. Do enjoy your sister's wedding today, and call me if I may be of any help. She slipped a card into his vest and retreated out of the church, his relatives giving the woman a wide berth. He didn't want to call her. He didn't want to stay in Bliss. He didn't want to play in the Golden Husband Games. Living with 11 sisters, though, CJ had acquired more than his share of knowledge about women, and he knew what he wanted didn't matter. This Queen General woman had a plan for him. He could fight it all he wanted, but the truth was simple. His future was no longer entirely within his own control. Natalie was in her car, a cathedral train length away from escaping St. Valentine's parking lot, when the Queen General stepped out of the front of the church and into the path of Natalie's car. Nat wanted to keep going. She still hadn't caught her breath or calmed her heart after the horrific realization that she'd just bared her soul to CJ Blue. All of her soul. That she didn't belong in Bliss. That she once wanted to be the Queen General. That he wrecked her marriage. The QG was going to kill her. Hang her from the center gazebo on the Bliss courthouse lawn with a giant D tattooed on her forehead and a "Divorcees be warned, thou art not welcome in Bliss" sign pinned to her dress. Because obviously Natalie would be in a dress, an ugly-ass second-hand black bridesmaid dress, most likely. There was some appeal to the thought of letting her car run over Marilyn. But the car stopped of its own volition under the power of the QG's frosty glare. Possibly because the car knew in a match between it and the QG would win. Or maybe the car stopped because Natalie didn't much like the idea that her son could grow up visiting Mommy in prison. Still, that would be better than his growing up without her at all. Was it possible to die of mortification? She hadn't yet, but the day was still young. She threw the car into park and rolled her window down. Miss Castellano. Disdain dripped from the QG's turned-down, painted lips. Natalie swallowed hard. Her mother had led the Husband Games subcommittee for the Knot Festival, reporting to Queen General Maryland for almost as many years as Natalie had been alive. By tradition, Natalie should have inherited her mother's place on the committee. It was how things were done in Bliss. But the QG had denied Natalie the privilege of formally continuing her mother's legacy. Were it not for Dad, Natalie would have had no role in Knotfest at all. Instead, he'd convinced the QG to let Natalie represent the Castellano family for one last Knotfest in Mom's honor. The QG had ultimately relented and put Natalie on the janitorial subcommittee. Being the QG, she had the capability to do worse. Much worse, especially after catching Natalie in a confessional with C.J. Blue. She swallowed once more, harder. "Mrs. Elias, nice to see you again." "It is my pleasure," the QG said, not sounding pleased in the least, "to present to you the news that Mr. C.J. Blue has been invited to play in the Golden Husband Games." She stopped and peered at Natalie expectantly, as though Nat was supposed to burst into a round of applause and make a few catcalls for a kiss. "Fantastic," Natalie said. The chorus of shits and dammits in her head were quickly adding up to a few more dollars she owed Noah's college fund. Today had been very profitable for the little guy. "I'm not interested in your opinion, Miss Castellano," the QG said. "I'm informing you so that you understand that he will accept his invitation and that you will have nothing further to do with him for the duration of his stay in Bliss. If I ever catch you in a compromising position with him again, I will not only remove you completely from the Knotfest committee, but I will also do everything in my power to remove you from the aisle. Are we clear?" As clear as the ice forming in Natalie's veins. Yes. While the QG had formally taken the Husband Games job from Natalie, the truth of what Natalie was doing was a bit stickier. And if she were completely and no doubt publicly removed from the Knotfest committee entirely, the golden anniversary of Mom's lifelong pet project would be nearly impossible to secretly keep afloat. Nat never wished she'd stayed married to Derek, and she never wished she hadn't had Noah. But being divorced was a pain in the ass, and that was a dime she'd happily give Noah's college fund. "We all have to live with our choices, Miss Castellano. I suggest you give your future wiser consideration than you have your past, starting now." If Natalie had a couple do-overs, she'd fix a lot of things, but she didn't have do-overs. She had do-your-bests. She also had an ugly suspicion that her time of doing her best in Bliss had just been shrunk like cotton in a dryer. Once again, she was letting her mother down. The QG stepped back from the car, gave a regal nod, and tucked her forearms behind her back. "Enjoy your afternoon, Miss Castellano." Natalie nodded meekly. She pulled away at a fraction of the speed her heart was racing. Mortification and regret were still giving her soul indigestion, and while she'd developed a pretty thick hide over the last 5 years, her eyes and throat burned as badly as they had at her mother's funeral. A nice afternoon? Not in Bliss.